On Thursday, U.S. President Donald Trump proclaimed that the United States will withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord, ending implementation of President Obama's carbon reduction targets and halting U.S. contributions to the United Nations Green Climate Fund. Trump's announcement was not a surprise, but it raises serious questions about the future of efforts to stop global warming, as well as the future of the United States, now that the world's second leading producer of greenhouse gases is officially no longer committed to international consensus on climate change. Fortunately, leaders in France, Germany, India, and other nations have already indicated their intention to proceed with their carbon reduction efforts under the Paris Accord. I understand that the Hôtel de Ville in Paris was illuminated in green the other night as a protest. The governor of California and many other Americans continue to support the Paris Accord as well, but Trump's announcement threatens to isolate the United States from the international community for years to come. In the context of an art history festival about nature and the United States, Trump's views demand analysis and critique, for they conjure ancient cultural assumptions even as they abound with modern contradictions and hypocrisies. During his announcement on Thursday, Trump declared that he is someone who cares deeply about the environment. Those are his words. He also espouses an interest in nature through various products sold under his brand name, including Trump Natural Spring Water, while his conservative allies describe Trump as the force of nature America needed to break out of the globalist era. And Melania Trump, the First Lady, has spoken about how, quote, the gift of nature and the beauties of the outdoors can contribute to the healing process of seriously ill children. Since the policies of Trump and his associates represent the worst assault on environmental health and justice in a generation, these hollow invocations of nature show us the inescapable politics of that term. Far from being a defense of nature or the environment, Trump's decision to withdraw from the Paris Accord embodies his promise to make America great again. It is this nostalgic, nationalistic promise that I wish to focus on as a topic of cultural and art historical discussion today. It directly recalls a famous 1980 campaign slogan of Ronald Reagan, "Let's make America great again." But it also recycles an ancient political and cultural cliché. The idea of restoring lost greatness has deep historical roots, going back to the Renaissance and Greco-Roman antiquity, when writers such as Hesiod, Virgil, Ovid, and the Medici imagined the return of a primordial golden age of peace and prosperity in which humanity supposedly existed in a harmonious state of nature, untainted by modern corruption or conflict. Donald Trump is probably completely ignorant of these historical prototypes, but his rhetoric inadvertently revives Golden Age nostalgia in an era of neoliberal capitalism marked by rapid change and stark inequality. Trump's own personal aura of golden wealth embodies a mythic standard of economic success and natural order that his supporters want to restore for America and for themselves. Of course, most Trump supporters are white, and a disturbing number of them regard his election as a validation of white supremacy, a fact confirmed by the upsurge of hate speech and violence against minorities in America since the presidential election. Trump himself avoids explicit racism, but his actions speak loudly. His administration's recent federal budget proposal calls for massive cuts in spending for government programs, including scientific research on climate change and advocacy for environmental justice, a fact that recently prompted Mustafa Ali, the director of environmental justice programs at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, to resign in protest. Trump has also called for the elimination of many environmental regulations, as well as large tax cuts for the wealthiest Americans, while promising to revive the dying coal industry. This photograph of Trump with his Environment Secretary, Scott Pruitt, surrounded by white coal miners, was orchestrated to exploit working-class sentiment in order to promote fossil fuels. It also sent an implicit message about the president's racial allegiances and preferences. Make America Great Again therefore implies a nostalgic reassertion of historical hierarchies in two senses. First, it signals a forceful redefinition of American exceptionalism in global relations by putting America first. Secondly, it tacitly endorses white supremacy in domestic politics. With the rise of Donald Trump, American exceptionalism and white supremacy have converged in a powerful longing for a return to traditional social hierarchy and national preeminence, which his supporters regard as the natural order of things. Trump is no historian or natural philosopher, but we might view his policies as essentially reviving and nationalizing the ancient principle of the great chain of being, in which human beings, specifically white men, stood atop the scale of nature in a position of power and privilege. This may seem to be a strange, anachronistic suggestion, but other actions by Trump also conjure very old ideas, including his appointment to the Supreme Court of Neil Gorsuch, a judge widely recognized to be a proponent of ancient moral beliefs about natural law. Ironically, Trump's neoliberal economic policies will naturally benefit the exceptionally rich at the expense of his white working-class supporters. But so far, this has not significantly dampened enthusiasm for the president among his closest followers. Using evidence from the history of art and visual culture, my presentation examines the Trump phenomenon as an extension of traditional beliefs about American exceptionalism, nature, and social hierarchy. Those beliefs were defined long ago by a dominant white majority that now faces growing resistance from a diversifying American population, whose minority demographic will become the majority before the middle of this century. After briefly tracing the history of American exceptionalism as an idea, I will highlight recent art informed by ecology and critical posthumanism that denaturalizes traditional assumptions about hierarchy and difference, thereby posing a challenge to Trumpian nostalgia. Although art by itself cannot dislodge entrenched hierarchical assumptions, it can provide a creative model for new, more egalitarian forms of thought and action. Ideas about American exceptionalism are well known to historians of art and visual culture. Many scholars locate the origins of American exceptionalism in early colonial declarations about New England as a shining white city upon a hill, invoking Christ's Sermon on the Mount, an idea endlessly recycled in political rhetoric and popular art, including this anonymous early 19th century folk painting of a generic American plantation. The idea later evolved into a vision of the United States as unique among nations, for its providential connection to nature, a place where chosen people could redeem a fallen human civilization by spreading democracy and reclaiming an original Edenic state of grace. Such thinking finds vivid expression in this 1861 picture by Frederick Church titled Our Banner in the Sky, showing a tree, stars, and twilight patriotically forming the national flag. Church painted this work during an upsurge of nationalism at the beginning of the American Civil War, but it expressed a deeper faith in the exceptional status of the United States as nature's nation. Historical beliefs about American exceptionalism also obviously presupposed various political exclusions and repressions. The most egregious of all was slavery, an institution based on the racist ideology of white supremacy and maintained through violence, biased cultural representations, and false science about the supposedly natural inferiority of others. One of the most notorious examples of this, of so-called natural science in the 19th century, appeared in a book by the American ethnologists Josiah Nott and George Glidden, who manipulated comparative anatomy and cultural references to rank different groups in a biased defense of slavery. Their 1854 treatise, Types of Mankind, interpreted the great chain of being as a racial scale of nature, construing whites and blacks as different and unequal species, with blacks allegedly closer to animals. The book illustrated this idea by showing a hierarchical arrangement of heads, including Apollo, the Greek god of reason, order, and harmony, embodying whiteness and symbolically presiding over a generic Negro and young chimpanzee. Most classically educated 19th century Americans would have viewed this arrangement as entirely natural, since the head of the Greek god here came from the Belvedere Apollo, the most celebrated surviving work of ancient Hellenistic art. As the historian Kirk Savage has observed, quote, "What is quite literally a comparison of God, man, and animal is nevertheless meant to be read as a comparison of white man, Negro, and animal." The persistence of racism and white supremacy in America today indicates the lingering power of such hierarchical thinking, more than 150 years after a destructive civil war was fought against it. The image of American exceptionalism has often coincided with racial expressions of white supremacy, as in this widely circulated cartoon by Frederick Opper, illustrating a popular magazine in 1893. It shows Uncle Sam personifying America's emerging prominence as a global superpower and host of the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, an international festival attended by more than 27 million visitors. Uncle Sam stands in the center, head and shoulders above other nations, whose representatives appear beside him as diminutive ethnic stereotypes. Here, nationalism and Anglo-Saxon ethnocentrism come together to construct an exceptional white America as world leader and host of the global spectacle, which in reality was racially segregated. With its grandiose classical architecture, the World's Columbian Exposition was nicknamed the White City and was intended to foreground the United States as the inheritor of European cultural hegemony. This explains the oversized image of Uncle Sam, assertively occupying the center of attention. An unfortunate echo of such historical imagery appeared recently when President Trump awkwardly pushed aside Prime Minister Duško Marković of Montenegro at the G7 summit in Brussels, in an embarrassing attempt to reassert American primacy and exceptionalism in the community of nations. During World War II, Norman Rockwell painted these pictures visualizing the four freedoms articulated by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt in a speech explaining American involvement in the war and promoting American ideals of individual liberty as a model for the world. In addition to serving as war bond poster images, Rockwell's freedom of speech, freedom from fear, freedom of worship, and freedom from want helped to sanctify these freedoms as cornerstones of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the United Nations in 1948. In another prominent expression of American exceptionalism during this moment, the powerful publisher Henry Luce described the 20th century as the American century in Time magazine. Like President Roosevelt, Luce argued the United States was in a unique position to, quote, exert upon the world the full impact of our influence for such purposes as we see fit and by such means as we see fit. With World War II, American exceptionalism had become an article of faith for U.S. presidents and the mainstream press. In the Cold War era, avant-garde art by the abstract expressionists was caught up in discourse about American exceptionalism when the Central Intelligence Agency used the Museum of Modern Art and other institutions to stage international exhibitions of work by the New York school painters to demonstrate U.S. cultural freedom as a foil to communist conformism. Recent revelations by former CIA case officers Donald Jameson and Tom Braden have confirmed that the agency established a special office known as the International Organizations Division to promote American jazz music, film, and modern art, including this 1958 traveling exhibition of abstract expressionism titled The New American Painting, as cultural evidence of free enterprise in the United States. Discussion and debate about American exceptionalism as a national discourse persists vigorously today, as indicated in this small sample of books published during the past decade. Critics like Godfrey Hodgson view American exceptionalism as a myth, arguing that the United States has much in common with Europe, whereas conservatives like former Vice President Dick Cheney believe the U.S. is the world's last great hope for protecting democracy, individual freedom, and free market capitalism. Even President Obama invoked American exceptionalism, but he did so not only to affirm United States leadership in the world, but also ideals of tolerance, inclusion, and diversity as part of a never-ending project of national construction and reconstruction. Characteristically, on this topic as on others, Donald Trump has spoken in a contradictory manner. In a 2016 campaign interview, Trump disavowed American exceptionalism, saying, quote, "I never liked the term, perhaps because I don't have a very big ego and I don't need terms like that," end quote. Trump went on to observe that the idea of American exceptionalism seemed problematic to him because he viewed the United States as a nation suffering from too much generosity. "We're dying," he asserted. "We owe $18 trillion in debt, and I want to take everything back from the world that we've given them." Eventually, however, Trump declared, "I'd like to make us exceptional." In other words, he sees the United States as a victim of its own liberality. Therefore, in order to achieve true exceptionalism, he believes he must make America great again and stop giving to the world. Trump's position is not so much a critique of American exceptionalism as a radical amplification and reorientation of it in the direction of isolationism, nativism, and xenophobia. Now, I would like to turn my attention to examples of artistic work that offer valuable critical counterpoints to the ideas of American exceptionalism and white supremacy espoused by Trump and his followers. As I've tried to suggest, the Trump phenomenon is not entirely new, but rather an extension of long-standing beliefs and biases in American cultural history. For that reason, I will begin my discussion of art with a few historical examples in order to demonstrate the presence of oppositional voices even in the past, revealing that American art and culture have never been entirely monolithic. During the 1830s, for example, Thomas Cole's allegorical series of paintings titled The Course of Empire quietly resisted American imperial expansionism during the presidency of Andrew Jackson by showing the rise and fall of an unspecified civilization through 5 historical phases, beginning with the savage state and followed by the pastoral or Arcadian state, consummation, destruction, and desolation. At the time, Cole was politically allied with the Whig Party, which opposed President Jackson's Democrats and their national program of expansionism, extension of slavery, and genocide against Native Americans. Cole's private journals expressed distaste for utilitarian economic development and Jacksonian views of the United States as an empire of democracy destined to conquer the continent of North America. He would later refer to the U.S. invasion of Mexico as, quote, this vile Mexican war. Although contemporaries apparently preferred to view the course of empire only as an allegory of ancient Rome, Cole had a different perspective. His generic title and setting for the series referred to all empires, including America's Empire of Liberty. As an English immigrant artist with a transnational perspective, Cole feared the U.S. under President Jackson might be repeating the mistakes of past empires and therefore in danger of declining, like Rome, into the abyss of history. Incidentally, unlike Cole, Donald Trump is a great admirer of Andrew Jackson. Immediately after his inauguration, Trump arranged to have a portrait of President Jackson hung in the Oval Office of the White House next to Frederick Remington's bronze statuette of a cowboy. In the 20th century, Robert Smithson offered a particularly rich critique of American exceptionalism in his Spiral Jetty, a work that subjected idealistic notions of national progress to the entropic forces of history and time, using materials that defy heroic narrative. Smithson located his famous 1970 earthwork in the Great Salt Lake, near the site of a triumphant national achievement 100 years before, when American industrialists completed the first transcontinental railroad, an event that facilitated rapid settlement and commercial development across the United States. Contrary to the prevailing mood of celebration in 1870 surrounding that achievement and its centennial anniversary in 1970, Smithson's Spiral Jetty constituted an ironic counter-monument in the form of a railroad to nowhere. This at a time when newer technological miracles like space travel could hardly conceal a host of daunting national problems, including conflicts over civil rights, environmental pollution, and the Vietnam War. Spiral Jetty embodied Smithson's alternative vision of art as a pragmatic, dialectical project for fostering relationships across the borders of ecology and industry, nature and culture. Indeed, Smithson regarded nature not as a romantic ideal, but as a social and political dialectic. Marc Dion's 1994 installation, titled Scala Naturae, revisits the great chain of being that ancient hierarchical vision of order in nature, rooted in Aristotle and handed down through the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, and into the modern world. Despite the longevity and influence of that hallowed humanistic scheme, Dion's installation mocks it as arbitrary and absurd, little more than a fanciful gathering of objects and stuffed specimens arranged to flatter human beings and their entrenched social relations. As Dion himself has observed in a recent interview, my relation to the scala naturae, or great chain of being, is a critical one, which I deal with in a form of comic scorn. The great chain of being is a conceptual tool created by and reflecting a rigidly hierarchical society, a society of slaves and masters. As someone who studies taxonomies and systems of classification, I've noticed that the first thing that becomes apparent is that those who draft the ranking, who design such schemes, place themselves firmly atop. The classical scala naturae, Dion says, is a pernicious idea with legs. It dominated the European intellectual culture of nature for centuries, and even when it was replaced, it remained a salient visual metaphor. As we have seen, this hierarchical visual metaphor has also influenced American thinking about nature and difference for a long time, with pernicious consequences for the history of race relations. Dion's installation, with its little white human head sitting ludicrously atop the scala naturae, one step above a stuffed duck and cat, critically interrogates the long tradition of using classical aesthetics as a tool of racial power and repression. Earlier this spring, after a chemical weapons attack by Syrian government forces that killed 80 people in the rebel-held town of Khan Sheikhoun, President Trump responded by calling Syrian President Bashar al-Assad an animal. According to news reports, French intelligence identified sarin gas as the substance used in this reprehensible act of violence, which also injured more than 100 people, including many civilians. Without calling into question the guilt of Assad or his murderous regime, I wish to highlight Trump's reference to animality here as an epithet of condemnation, for it again reveals his nostalgia for traditional forms of hierarchy and difference. To condemn another person as an animal is to assert a fundamental belief in the human as a transcendent category of being, qualitatively distinct from and superior to other forms of life. Here once more, we find ourselves in the ancient realm of the great chain of being, with man supposedly occupying a position of absolute authority and privilege, closer to God than his fellow earthly beings. Maintaining this anthropocentric view has become increasingly problematic in recent years, however, in the face of a large and growing body of scholarship about non-human mental abilities. Abilities which demonstrate that human beings have no monopoly on sentience, intelligence, or emotion. From Darwin to Derrida to Donna Haraway and beyond, the question of the animal has prompted scientists and philosophers alike to reconsider the exceptionalism of the Homo sapiens. In 2012, an international group of scientists led by Stephen Hawking, issued the Cambridge Declaration on Consciousness in Non-Human Animals, proclaiming that, quote, humans are not unique in possessing the neurological substrates that generate consciousness. Donald Trump's negative invocation of animality as a sign of unequivocal difference from humanity therefore rests on obsolete cultural assumptions that a number of artists have been critically interrogating for years. For example, Patricia Piccinini has created various life-size sculptural installations using silicone, acrylic, wood, human hair, and other materials to explore human perceptions about the borders between species. In this 2003 example titled The Young Family, from her series We Are Family, Piccinini represents what she calls, quote, a trans-species mother with a litter of suckling pups as ordinary beings with impulses to love and play. At the same time, the artist says, they are animated by the stranger, more physically unusual aspects of their being, or their encounter with mutant life forms. Normal becomes mutant, and vice versa. Within this world, there is an acceptance that each term defines the other. Piccinini describes her work as exploring ethical questions raised by biotechnology, including what is normal? What is the nature of our relationship with animals? Are some lives worth more than others? What constitutes a family? Such questions force us to reassess the invocation of animal as a negative term of condemnation, especially in light of the emerging recognition in science and philosophy of our evolutionary relation to other species. The Chicago-based artist Eduardo Katz has pursued similar questions using his own genetic material in the creation of living interspecies hybrids through biotechnology. Between 2003 and 2008, Katz produced a series of bio-art works titled Natural History of the Enigma, including a new life form he called a plantimal. The example you see here is titled Edunia, which the artist has described as, quote, a genetically engineered flower that is a hybrid of myself and a petunia. The Edunia expresses my DNA exclusively in its red veins. The new flower is a petunia strain that I invented and produced through molecular biology. It is not found in nature. The Edunia has red veins on light pink petals, and a gene of mine is expressed on every cell of its red veins. That is, my gene produces a protein in the veins only. The gene was isolated and sequenced from my blood. The petal pink background against which the red veins are seen is evocative of my own pinkish white skin tone. The result of this molecular manipulation is a bloom that creates the living image of human blood rushing through the veins of a flower. Katz has also commented on the broader implications of this project by saying the following. Natural history of the enigma is a reflection on the contiguity of life between different species. This work seeks to instill in the public a sense of wonder about this most amazing of phenomena we call life. The general public may have no difficulty in considering how close we truly are to apes and other non-human animals, particularly those with which it is possible to communicate directly, such as cats and dogs. However, the thought that we are also close to other life forms, including flora, will strike most as surprising. In the photograph at right, Katz, in effect, is watering part of himself. When I've discussed the work of Piccinini and Katz in art history classes, students often express feelings of disgust and revulsion and discomfort. But when we consider these artistic experiments as models for critical reflection about the more far-reaching forms of genetic manipulation carried out routinely by the biotechnology industry, the students become more sympathetic and interested. Another artist whose work raises challenging questions about empathy, ethics, and our relation to other species is Anita Crank, an activist with the organization Toronto Pig Save, who has used photography to reveal the usually invisible logistics of the meat industry. Here we see one of the many photographs she took in 2012 showing pigs in transport trucks on their way to the slaughterhouse. Unlike more familiar and shocking animal rights imagery, Crank's photographs differ in the way they quietly encourage us to recognize the sentience, cognition, and emotional capacity of these animals, whose lives we usually encounter only in death, in the form of abstract meat commodities at the grocery store or in restaurants. In other words, the photographs perform an ecological function by exposing the hidden economy of industrial food, with its banal but terrifying moments in the transition between living beings and dead meat. Crank's abstract technique of framing the eye of these animals as they look at us through the metal openings of trucks fosters empathy by placing emphasis on visual reciprocity across species. We have just enough information to recognize them as pigs, a species often compared with dogs in their intelligence and therefore fully capable of confronting us with a knowing look. A more humorous perspective on interspecies relations can be seen in the work of Sam Easterson, an artist videographer who tries to depict the point of view of other animals in ordinary situations of their daily life. In a twist on the popular animal video genre, Easterson has created dozens of what he calls critter cams by attaching wireless micro video and sound recording equipment to a wide variety of animals, designing the equipment to fall off harmlessly after a few minutes. Here we see a still image from the armadillo cam video, which provides an intimate view of the animal scuttling around on the desert ground of the American Southwest, sniffing air, eating plants, and digging dirt. Easterson has also made videos with plants and inanimate objects like tumbleweeds and popcorn machines, but working with non-human animals has been his main interest. As the artist explains, quote, "If people can see things from the animal and plant perspective, they are far less likely to harm them or their habitat. The first thing I realized was how intelligent and aware the animals are. The project changed everything for me in terms of respect." Collaborating with bioethicists and remote sensing experts to track animals in the wild, Easterson compiled hundreds of short videos in an online public database he called the Museum of Animal Perspectives. The project brought him wide recognition, including major artistic awards as well as high-profile media attention. His Museum of Animal Perspectives became so popular that the system crashed and he was forced to shut it down in 2010. Sorry, you can't really see that very well, but I'll try to explain it. Critical perspectives about nature and nationalism have appeared with growing frequency in recent art as climate change has posed a looming challenge of global proportions. Responding to this situation, some artists have treated old American patriotic narratives with scathing irony and satire. For example, Alexis Rockman's enormous 2003 painting, Manifest Destiny, interprets climate catastrophe as the direct outcome of American exceptionalism. In this haunting futuristic vision, New York City has become inundated with water from melting polar ice. Devoid of human beings, the ruined city serves as a habitat only for animals that have evolved in adapting to the changing environment. Conceived in consultation with evolutionary biologists and environmental scientists, Rockman's 24-foot mural redefines manifest destiny as an exceptional catastrophe, which Americans did much to create and may be unable to avoid. In recent years, scientists have increasingly used the term Anthropocene to describe the advent of a new geological epoch of human making, in which evidence of our impact as a species is so pervasive and transformative that the idea of a pristine, untouched nature has become obsolete. Already in 1989, the environmental activist Bill McKibben responded to this new reality by writing about the end of nature. More recently, a chorus of other scholars, including Timothy Morton, Jedediah Purdy, and Stephen Vogel, have addressed the cultural and ethical implications of this predicament in a number of new books, arguing for the abandonment of romantic nostalgia about nature in favor of an ecological perspective that denaturalizes environmental politics and confronts problems of injustice in the human-built environment that is our planet. Some needed comic relief. The massive scale of our environmental crisis today makes parochial nationalism and idealistic naturalism look increasingly narrow and out of touch with reality. As many scientists and activists have informed us, the effects of global warming are already here, exacerbating environmental inequality, food and water shortages, and refugee migrations around the world. In light of such challenges, exceptionalist rhetoric about making America great again misses the point and promises to do more harm than good. As usual, artists are providing welcome critical alternatives to such thinking. I'll conclude my presentation by highlighting two examples that bring together a post-natural ecological understanding with critical attention to environmental justice. One of these was on view at the Palais de Tokyo in Paris during the 2015 COP21 United Nations Climate Change Conference. It consisted of a dynamic multimedia installation that visualized global data about human migration since the early 1990s. The installation was created by the American architecture and design firm of Diller, Scofidio, and Renfro, with inspiration from the French philosopher Paul Virilio and collaborative input from an interdisciplinary team of artists, scientists, and statisticians. Titled simply Exit, the installation consisted of sound and moving images projected on the wall of a darkened circular gallery, dramatically rendering information about the dislocation of hundreds of thousands of people around the world as a result of war, economic inequality, and environmental disruption. According to a statement by the artists, current political, economic, and environmental forces have led to levels of human migration never before seen in history. Exit is a visual representation of the world's population in motion. The installation surrounded viewers with the repetitive motion of a globe that circled the room, spinning with each orbit and translating various migration data into dynamic maps, texts, and graphs. Pixels of color morphed from the shape of one national flag to another, signifying millions of dollars or euros in remittances sent by immigrants to family members back home. Flowing streams of variously hued dots represented hundreds of thousands of displaced refugees. And the names of several dozen densely populated coastal cities around the world suddenly were submerged with a splashing sound, denoting the anticipated impact of polar ice melt and ocean elevation rise due to global warming by the year 2100. Many other categories of data were visualized as well. The static images reproduced here hardly capture the dynamic complexity of the installation or its multisensory impact. After viewing the installation at the Palais de Tokyo, I came away with two main thoughts. One, the massive scale of human migration now and in the coming century looks more and more like a problem of environmental injustice, in which large, disenfranchised populations are forced to exit their native lands due to ecological disruption, resulting from fossil fuel consumption and other violent vectors. Two, Such conditions represent a daunting challenge, but also an opportunity for artists interested in advancing environmental justice. My concluding example comes from the Documenta 14 exhibition, currently on view in Athens, where a collaborative team of Native American artists called Post Commodity have installed a somewhat more lyrical multimedia work about the problem of global migration. Their installation, titled "The Ears Between Worlds Are Always Speaking," consists of a large electronic speaker called a long-range acoustic device, or LRAD, projecting sounds in the direction of the ruins of Aristotle's Lyceum, an archaeological site in Athens. The projected sounds are folk songs of international migrants, recorded by the artists in Greece and neighboring countries. Post Commodity chose this specific location because Aristotle's Lyceum is believed to be the origin of peripatetic learning, a form of knowledge created by people in motion. In effect, the folk wisdom of today's migrants resonates with and speaks back to the inventor of peripatetic Greek philosophy, producing a symbolic global encounter of mobile wisdoms. The choice of technology here has special significance for the artists because the LRAD is a powerful acoustic device sometimes used by police and military authorities to combat political demonstrators, including those of Native American environmental activists or water protectors protesting against the Dakota Access Pipeline project in North Dakota in the United States last year. In this way, post-commodity connects the problems of environmental injustice with the global migration and refugee crisis as a way of suggesting both resist entrenched political power and economic interests. With their international perspectives on problems of environmental justice, works of art like these represent a welcome alternative to Donald Trump's American exceptionalism, xenophobia, and nostalgia for traditional social hierarchy. They also demonstrate the importance of recognizing that nature is not a neutral or absolute ground of truth, but rather an inescapably political concept. Thank you.